Welcome back again. Now we're going to carry on to the very last part of the Upakilesa Sutta, when you overcome kind of all the barriers, all the blockages to the Uttari Manusa Dhammas, the jhana states, and then awakening itself. So we're going to finish that one, and then we will see what happens next. So after this idea of understanding why sometimes there is just forms and there is no light, sometimes there is just light, no forms, then of course the point is that you want this combination of light and forms. This is the most powerful way of taking you into samadhi. And this sort of is interesting because sometimes there is a discussion in Buddhist circles, meditation circles, about what is the right way to access jhana. Do you need the light nimittas, do you not? And this seems to suggest that these light nimittas actually are maybe not always, but seem to be very common, the standard way to access the jhana states. And then comes the very last part here. So I'll just read this out first of all. While meditating, heedful, keen, and resolute, I perceived limited light and saw limited forms. I perceived limitless light and saw limitless forms. And this went on for a whole night, a whole day, and a whole night and day. I thought, what is the cause? What is the reason for this? It occurred to me when my immersion, when my samadhi, my stillness is limited, then my vision is limited. And with a limited vision, I perceive limited light and see limited forms. But when my samadhi is limitless, then my vision is limitless. And with limitless vision, I perceive limitless lights and see limitless forms. And this goes on for a whole night, a whole day, and a whole night and day. So here, what we are saying is basically just the expansion of the mind coming to a point when there are no limits anymore. And of course, some of the classical places in the suttas when things are said to be limitless is the appamana, is the Pali word, and that is the 4 Brahmaviharas. In the Brahmaviharas, things are without limits. And what that means is that everything is included. All beings are included. There is not kind of one Uncle Bob you don't like, so you exclude him. Uncle Bob also is included. Very fortunate for Uncle Bob that he's included in the Appamana Brahmaviharas. And so everything is included. And the other place where you see the idea of things being limited or not limited is within the Kasina meditations, where the mind, the form that you perceive is either limited or unlimited. So you kind of spread it out and all limits are gone. With the nimittas here, it's a little bit different, but when you enter in the jhana states, this is probably a slightly different way of looking at things. They're not usually called appamana, but there is there's some degree of similarity in that the mind, you don't really perceive any limits normally in these states either. It's like the mind kind of expands. So now, once we have overcome all of these obstacles and we have kind of found the right approach to enter the samadhi, we are ready for the jhana states. We have come to the kind of the first goal of the path, which is to enter samadhi, which in this case refers to the 4 jhanas. So let's see what the Buddha does next. All obstacles have been overcome. What do we do then? After understanding that doubt, loss of focus, dullness and drowsiness, fear, excitement, discomfort, excessive energy, overly lax energy, longing, perception of diversity, and excessive staring at forms are corruptions of the mind. I had given them up. I thought, I have given up my mental corruptions. Now let me develop samadhi in 3 ways. I developed samadhi by placing the mind and keeping it connected, without placing the mind but keeping it connected, without placing the mind or keeping it connected, and then with rapture, without rapture, with pleasure, with equanimity. So it's a little bit strange. It says 3 ways, and then the sutta really has something like 6 ways or whatever, so it's a little bit not clear exactly what is going on there, whether there has been an expansion or something. But anyway, what does this mean? So these are the jhanas, and here they are talked about in a way that is a little bit unusual. It is not the usual jhana formulas. So the first one here, you develop samadhi by placing the mind and keeping it connected. This is savitaka savichara. Yeah, this was one of the questions yesterday about vitaka and vichara, which was it said vitaka, it should really be savitaka, with vitaka, with vichara. And so this is the idea that the samadhi is not yet quite complete. This refers to the first jhana state. There's still a little bit of movement in the mind. It's like a involuntary movement, an automatic movement of the mind. There's not the sense that you are doing it. It's something that you have no control over. And so it is like the wobble of the mind is what Ajahn Brahm calls this idea of samadhi at this particular stage. And then, of course, you go through these stage by stage as you do these things. But before I do that, what is interesting here, and I think an important point, is what happens as you move from non-jhana into jhana. Yeah, because this is something that is quite a profound thing to do. You're moving essentially, you're moving from what is often called the kama loka to the rupa loka. In the suttas, it's actually called the kam avachara and to the rup avachara, the sphere of kama to the sphere of rupa. And why is that so? Why is that tricky? Why is it so easy to get stuck on the stage of the nimittas, of the lights in the mind? And the reason is because in that movement from one world to the next one, from one sphere to the next one, you are completely abandoning something. Prior to that, you are still holding on to some extent. You still have access to the 5 senses if you want to. They may have disappeared, but you can. If you want to hear, you can still hear. You can still make that decision. You still have access to them. And the same thing with the will. If you want to will something, if you want to look at something else, think about something, you can. Yeah, you still have a sense of being in charge. But at the entry to the jhana, you're leaving these things behind. And that is why it is difficult. That is why it is not difficult maybe, but why it is a difficult letting go. You have to let go in a very profound way, whereby you are giving up the very act of being able to see, being able to hear. Yeah, it is like you're going blind. You are accepting that blindness is okay, because where you're going is far more profound. Giving up the 5 senses completely. And so this is why when we move from one world to another one, it is paramount that you have fully seen the disadvantage, the downside of the 5 senses. If you haven't fully understood the downside of the 5 senses, you will not be able to let them go. Yeah, you will still hold on to these things to some extent. And the same thing with the will. You have to really have understood the problem of the will, why the will is painful, why it is a torture, why peace is a far more powerful state than actually being able to do something and the mind moving and these kind of things. So you understand the downside, then you're able to let go, and then you're able to make that transition from one world to another one. And this is what kind of is the hallmark of entering the jhana. There's a transition going on. Previously there was like a gradual movement, but now there is a transition because you're abandoning something completely. And then you enter this alternative reality of the jhanas. And this is what the Buddha is describing here, is these jhana realities which are coming up now. And I always find it very fascinating. Ajahn Brahm always says what an extraordinary genius the Buddha was to be able to describe these states. Because these days are so out of the ordinary. There's no reference points anymore. All our reference points relate to the world of the five senses. They relate to the ability to will, the ability to do, our ordinary understanding of the five khandhas. And when all those reference points are gone, how do you describe these states, these attainments, if you like, these achievements, these jhanas? And so that is what makes it such a genius to be able to explain these things. There are a little bit of reference points left. The reference points that remain are things like piti and sukha, because you had that beforehand, and now you have a new version of them. So there is some reference point, but most of the reference points are completely gone. So the first jhana then, savitaka savichara, there is still a movement that is completely within the mind. Yeah? That's why it's called savitaka savichara. Then you have avitaka savichara. Talked about this yesterday. I'll just go briefly through it again. To give up the vitaka. The vitaka is the placing of the mind, the moving towards the object. The vichara is what holds on a little bit. There's a little bit of holding on left. Then there is avitaka, avichara, when you give up all the placing and all the holding, and the samadhi is finally complete. And that is the second jhana. So the first jhana, and then you have like the 1.5 jhana, and then the second jhana. This is what is meant by these things. I will not go into too much details now, because I think it's just not really worth it. We can discuss these things more, if you wish, when we have discussions or whatever. And then it says the mind with rapture. The mind with rapture is the first 2 jhanas. The mind with pleasure, that is the first 3 jhanas, and the mind with equanimity is usually the 4th jhana, and perhaps the 3rd jhana. The 3rd and the 4th jhana is what is meant by these things. These are the different way of classifying the jhanas. So this is what the Buddha does. And then comes the very last part of the sutta. When I had developed samadhi, had developed stillness in these ways, the knowledge and vision, the jnana dasana, arose in me. My freedom is unshakable. This is my last rebirth. Now there is no more future lives. And this is kind of one of those extraordinary things about the way that the suttas often express the path. You enter the jhanas, and when you come out of them, because you bring a degree of right view to those states, then when you come out, you automatically know how to contemplate them. You know how to view them, and because you view them in the right way, you give up your attachment to them, and then you achieve awakening as a consequence. I always found it very interesting that the Noble Eightfold Path, it ends with the 4 jhanas. It doesn't end with vipassana. It doesn't end with what you have to do. It ends with the 4 jhanas. Because if you have the 4 jhanas and you have right view, that combination is usually enough to automatically lead the mind to abandoning the fetters and then becoming at least a stream enterer, probably an anagami after jhana, but ideally an arahant. And this is how the Buddha becomes an arahant. Of course, the Buddha did something else. And what he did was also recall his past lives. So he knew the dukkha of the round of existence. And because of that, views in the 4th jhana, based on that, then he made an end of everything. So that was the additional information that the Buddha had, and also understanding karma. And then there was no more rebirth. No more renewed lives. And that is the end. The freedom is unshakable. This is my last rebirth. There are no more future lives. So this is the end of the path. So this is what is the purpose of Buddhism. Purpose of Buddhism is not to just chill, it is to end rebirth. No more future lives. And it's kind of fascinating. There are people in the world who call themselves Buddhists, but they don't believe in rebirth. And to me that is just impossible, because the purpose of Buddhism is to end rebirth. And if you don't believe in rebirth, you don't believe in the purpose of Buddhism. So how can you be a Buddhist? Are you taking the Buddha as your teacher, or are you not? You have to make a decision at some point. this is what Buddhism is about, that this is the problem of existence, the round of existence. It may seem obvious to us, but it always fascinates me that people think that it's possible to get rid of rebirth and still be a Buddhist. To me, that doesn't make any sense, basically. So, this is what the Buddha said. Satisfied, the Venerable Anuruddha was happy with what the Buddha had said. So, there you are. This is the beautiful, marvelous, amazing Upakilesa Sutta. It has a lot of interesting Dhamma in it, from starting out with the quarreling monks and ending with the full enlightenment. There's a lot in there. And it's a sutta that in many ways is quite unique. It has a lot of information that you don't find elsewhere. It matches with the other sutta. It doesn't contradict. So I think it's very likely to be one of the Buddha's genuine discourses. But it has a lot of interesting additional information that is not encountered in other suttas. It makes it very special and, to my mind, very interesting. So far we have now looked at how to attain samadhi via using the breath. We have looked at how to work with the mind to overcome the defilements. We have looked at the natural process of meditation and all of these things. And what I want to look at now is a little bit more of how to develop the basic joy and the happiness at the beginning. This is such an important part of the path, the ability to find the joy, find the gladness in the meditation, and kind of fuse that with the anapanasati. When you watch the breath and the joy come together, that is when it becomes very powerful. And some people find it difficult to give rise to joy, so I think it is important to contemplate this a little bit. And one of the classical suttas that really talk about this is the Mahanama Sutta that is coming up now. And this is, again, it shows meditation path from a slightly different angle again. So let us just get into this and see where this takes us. So this is from the Anguttara Nikaya 6s, the Chatta Nipata, Sutta number 10, the Mahanama Sutta. At one time, the Buddha was staying in the land of the Sakyans, near Kapilavatthu, in the Banyan Tree Monastery. Then Mahanama the Sakyan went up to the Buddha, bowed, sat down to one side, and said to him, "Sir, when a noble disciple has reached the fruit and understood the instructions, what kind of meditation do they frequently practice?" Mahanama, when a noble disciple has reached the fruit and understood the instructions, they frequently practice this kind of meditation. And now comes 6 kinds of meditation, or 6 kinds of contemplations that the noble disciple frequently practices. So in this sutta, the Buddha is visiting his relatives, the Sakyan, in the Sakyan land, and he is in their main town called Kapilavatthu, and that Kapilavatthu can be visited even now. There is some rivalry in India, between India and Nepal, about which country has the real Kapilavatthu. And I think India has won that contest because there is a Kapilavatthu in India where they discovered some seals, archaeological remains, and these seals, they were inscribed with Kapilavatthu. And so I think that is a very strong indication that they found the real place, whereas the site in Nepal was a little bit more dodgy. So you can still go and find Kapilavatthu in the present day, which is kind of I don't know, what's the right word? Cool, kind of cool. I think it's a little bit cool that we can visit these ancient places in India to the present day. So that is where the Buddha is staying, in the Nigrodha Arama. Nigrodha is the banyan tree. And of course, then he meets his relatives, and one of his famous relatives is Mahanama the Sakyan. So we have just seen Anuruddha in the previous sutta, and now we see Mahanama in this sutta. And both Anuruddha and Mahanama were Sakyans. And they happened to be brothers, right? Mahanama and Anuruddha were brothers, according to the story. And that's kind of nice, yeah? All this kind of the Sakyan clan, his family, they were obviously very interested in the Dhamma. And it's must show something about the power of the Buddha. He's able to convert even his family. Usually the last people to convert, to become Buddhists, is your family, right? They reject, no way, I'm going to listen to my son. Yeah, my son, he doesn't know what he's talking about or whatever. It's very unusual. I see many, of course, if you're in a Buddhist country, it's a bit different. But if you come from a non-Buddhist country, you see a lot of monks from non-Buddhist countries. The last person the parents are going to listen, the parents are going to listen to is their son or the daughter. Yeah, if the son or the daughter decides to become a Buddhist monk or nun, the parents are going to reject. Very often they reject that; they don't listen. But with the Buddha, obviously, he was very powerful. So because of his powers, because of his special charisma, whatever you want to call it, the Sakyans kind of came around and they listened to him. And then when the Buddha visited the Sakyan Republic, all the Sakyans would come out and they would ask for ordination. Yeah? And so every family, they had like one son. I think this was before the bhikkhunis were established, at least one son who decided to go forth and become a monk. And then in the family of Mahanama and Anuruddha, they saw everyone else kind of becoming monks. And so Mahanama thought, well, we haven't got anyone from our family. One of us should go forth. Anuruddha, one of us should go forth. And Anuruddha says to Mahanama, the monastic life is really hard, and I have been really brought up, I've been really plush upbringing, really I had everything I ever wanted. I always had the cakes I wanted. The story of the nutty cakes, right? The famous story of nutty cakes. This is, I'm not sure where it is from, but probably one of the commentarial stories. And Ajahn Brahm tells the story of the nutty cakes. And this is when Anuruddha's upbringing was so soft, he always had everything he wanted. And so one day he went to his mother and asked for cakes. And his mother said, nutty cakes, which means there are no cakes. But Anuruddha thought it was a kind of cakes, the nutty cakes. That's kind of how soft he was brought up. He had never heard the word there isn't before. And so now, because he had never heard the word there isn't before, when Mahanama says, let's go, one of us should go forth, he says, no, too difficult for me. I can't live at the root of a tree. I can't do these kind of things. You go forth. And then Mahanama says, well, okay, in that case, if I go forth, you have to look after the household. Oh, yeah, says Anuruddha, what do you mean I have to look after the household? Well, you have to do all the chores of the household. Yeah, well, exactly what are those chores? Anuruddha had no idea what was going on in the household. He had been kind of far too plush an upbringing. Well, when the spring comes, you have to till the fields. And after tilling the fields, you have to kind of get rid of all the rocks. And then getting rid of the rocks, you have to sow the seeds. You have to make furrows first of all, then you have to sow the seeds. After sowing the seeds, you have to irrigate the field. After irrigating the field, you have to drain the field. And after draining the field, the weeds will come up, you have to weed the field. After weeding the field, you then have to collect the harvest. After collecting the harvest, you have to thresh the harvest. After threshing the harvest, you have to winnow, so you get the seeds out. After getting all the seeds out, you have to store the seeds in the silo to be ready for the rest of the season. And by the time all that work is finished, the next season begins. And Anuruddha says, but when is the work finished? And Maharaj said, the work is never finished. While our fathers and grandfathers were doing this work, they died while they were doing this work, and the work still isn't finished. And Anuruddha says, well, in that case, I go forth and you stay in the household life. This is the story of Mahanama and Anuruddha, and this is why Mahanama is still a householder, because Mahanama was kind of the hard-working person who was able to do this. Of course, it turned out that Anuruddha was a very good monk, so he eventually became an arahant. As we saw in the previous sutta, he was doing all the right things, but they had a kind of interesting relationship to each other. So what then happens with Mahanama? And this is, so then he goes up to the Buddha, he bows down, and he's obviously a very well-practiced person. We know from other suttas that he probably was a stream enter at a certain point, and that is precisely why he asked this question. When a noble disciple has reached the fruit, the pala, has understood the instructions. Understanding the instructions means that you are a stream enter. A stream enter is one who has understood the Dhamma, the sasana has understood that. So what kind of practice do they frequently do? So basically, this kind of practice that we're going to see now is the practice of someone who is a stream enter, someone who is an Aryan. And you will notice that the practices we're going to talk about are, first of all, the recollection of the triple gem, recollection of the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And of course, the people who understand the triple gem are the Aryans. They really understand what it means. And so for an Aryan to reflect on the Buddha, they know exactly what the Buddha is. And so it's very easy to give rise to joy, the Dhamma, and these kind of things. But this does not mean that for the rest of people, the rest of us, this is not to be done. We can still do these kind of practices. It's just that it won't be as powerful as it will be for the Aryans. But we should try, because these are access ways to be able to achieve joy. There are other places in the suttas where these recollections are also used for non-Aryans, for ordinary people. And so we know that they were used by everybody. It's just that it won't be as powerful. So that's just a little bit of the background. And then the Buddha tells us how to do this, the kind of practice, the kind of meditation it says here. Well, the word for meditation is really the Pali says, how should you dwell? In other words, how should you be? How should you kind of proceed in your life is really what it means. It doesn't necessarily mean formal meditation, but it means how to apply your mind in a certain way. So firstly, a noble disciple recollects the Buddha, the realized one. That blessed one is perfected, a fully awakened Buddha, accomplished in knowledge and conduct, holy, knower of the world, supreme guide of those who wish to train, teacher of gods and humans, awakened and blessed. When a noble disciple recollects the Buddha, their mind is not full of greed, hate, or delusion. At that time, their mind is unswerving, based on the Buddha. A noble disciple whose mind is unswerving finds inspiration in the meaning and the teaching, finds joy connected with the teaching. When they are joyful, rapture springs up. When the mind is full of rapture, the body becomes tranquil. When the body is tranquil, they feel bliss. And when they are blissful, their mind becomes stilled. This is called a noble disciple who lives in balance among people who are unbalanced, who lives untroubled among people who are untroubled. They have entered the stream of the teaching and developed the recollection of the Buddha. So you will recognize straight away here the same sequence that we have seen before, right? Joy, pamoja, rapture, piti, tranquility, passaddhi, bliss, sukha, and then finally samadhi. The same kind of sequence. But here it shows you how the sequence how you can get it started by thinking in the right way, through the recollection of the Buddha and the qualities of the Buddha. These qualities that you see here, they're often called the Buddha guna in Pali, the quality, what the Buddha actually is. And this little verse here, this little paragraph which talks about the qualities of the Buddha, the Blessed One is perfected all the way to awakened and blessed at the end. This is this very famous paragraph that you find throughout the suttas, the Itipiso Bhagava Arahang, Samma Sambuddho, Vijja Charana Sampanno, etc. This is the one, right? So the point is, and this is what we are seeing here, is that when the Buddha says that we recollect the Buddha, we should do it in this particular way. This is how we should remember the Buddha. And that is kind of important, yeah? So we try to follow these kind of instructions, then there's a good chance we'll be able to get it roughly right. And then that has the power then to drive this whole process. And then we join the forces of the pamudja, the gladness, the joy. We join that with a meditation object like watching the breath, and that combination is then becomes very powerful to guide the mind towards samadhi. So how can we make this work? How can we actually get this out of this thing? Now, all of these qualities that you see here, they really are about a person who has a particularly profound insight into the nature of reality. Someone who has understood the human condition. Someone who understands the distinction between happiness and suffering. Someone who has seen the broad picture of what life really is about. And I had a nice chat with Venerable Metta Vihari just last night, a very short talk with him. And he told me this very nice little story. He said that when he was young, before he was a Buddhist, when he still had long hair, you haven't got long hair anymore, Venerable, but so the long hair is gone, but when he still had long hair, you know what it was like when he grew up back in the 1960s, everyone in the West had long hair. This was kind of the kind of standard uniform of Westerners. You had to have long hair. It was with the Beatles area and all of these kind of things, and the flower power area, the power of all the the hippies and these kind of things. And it was also a kind of a spiritual time, and Venerable Bhante Metta Vihari told me that, even then, just hearing about people who had practiced meditation, who had some deep experience and some understanding of reality, even before he was Buddhist, was kind of really uplifting, and it gave rise to a degree of happiness. And immediately I knew what he was talking about, because that is actually a very important point. It's the idea that there are people in the world that go beyond, outside of the ordinary human experience. The dukkha that we are all experiencing, the life ending in death, the old age, the decrepitude, the continuous impermanence of everything. Human life isn't that great. It's full of so many kinds of suffering, so many kinds of problems. And then when you hear about someone else who has discovered something more profound, there's something very joyous about that, because it holds the promise that there is more to life than the humdrum, ordinary things that we all have to do. 2 kids, 1 car, half a dog and 3/4 of a cat or whatever that the average person has. 2.5 kids or whatever it is. Actually, these days people don't have many kids anymore. But this is the humdrum life. You go to school, you study really hard, and your parents tell you study hard, because if you get good grades, then you go to a good university. You go to the university, study hard, because then you get a good job. You get a good job, work hard, because then you get a promotion. And then you get a promotion, work hard to get another promotion. And then you become a pensioner. And then you die. And you wonder, why? Why? What was the point? I went through all of these things. And when you are young and you see everyone in the world doing these things, and you are sharp enough to understand that actually there isn't much point to it. There is this promise that there is some kind of meaning in this, but actually it is not very meaningful at all. It's becoming more and more obvious the older you get. But those who are really sharp, they get this at the very beginning. What is the point of all of this? And then you hear about somebody, like Bhante Metta Vihari was saying, you hear about someone who has understood something really profound, really deep, something beyond the ordinary experience, and it brings you hope, it brings you joy. You want to bow down to a person like that because they have access to a treasure that you do not have access to. And of course, the person that Bhante Metta Vihari was talking about is nobody compared to the Buddha. It is a fairly ordinary person by contrast. And so when you hear the Buddha, you have access to a person who really has understood the human condition, understood everything there is about happiness and suffering, who has attained the most profound meditations that are possible in the world. He is the loke chakku, the eye in the world, the one who sees first, who allows us to follow after. This is what the Buddha is. And when you understand that, it lifts you up because it gives access to more than the humdrum, ordinary existence of our lives, which basically are. It's a terrible thing to say, but basically human life isn't all that. It doesn't have much meaning unless you have a spiritual path. That is where the meaning comes from. And so the idea that the Buddha has that insight, wow, what an amazing thing that is. What an extraordinary thing it is that human beings like this exist in the world. And so why is it that sometimes we don't get the joy when we contemplate in this way? Why is it so hard? And I think a difference between the person that Bhante Metta Vihari was talking about is that this was like a living person. And because it is a living person, there is a feeling that we can relate to that living person. It's someone we can understand, someone we can talk to, someone we can ask questions, we can observe them. What is their conduct like? And so we have some kind of means of appreciating them and actually figuring out what is going on. But often when we think about the Buddha, it's like, is the Buddha, how real is the Buddha? Is the Buddha a legend? Is the Buddha a myth? Okay, so the Buddha probably existed, but what kind of person was he? Was he an ordinary person at all? Can you really talk to the Buddha? What is he like? And anyway, he lived 2,500 years ago. 2,500 years ago, people were really primitive, right? The life was just really kind of simple. How can we compare life 2,500 years ago with life today? They didn't even have iPhones, for goodness sake. How could they survive in those days? Actually, probably survive much better without the iPhone. But anyway, and also a different culture, right? Different culture, different time, legendary feeling. So part of the problem, one of the reasons why it is difficult to connect with the Buddha is the feeling of separation, the feeling that we are kind of so far apart that the Buddha has become a legend. So one of the first things that we have to do to be able to get the joy, we have to reconnect with the Buddha. In the same way that Bhante Metta Vihari was able to connect with this person when he was young, we have to reconnect to the Buddha in the same way here. And the very first thing to do, to be able to do that, is to understand that the Buddha was a human being. That is what makes the Buddha so powerful. That is what makes him so extraordinary, because he was able to take this ordinary human condition, understand it for what it is, and then transcend it, go beyond it, understand what is really happening. That is the extraordinary feat of the Buddha. So the Buddha is basically the same as us. There is basically no difference. And when he becomes an arahant, still that is also the same, because each one of us has the same potential. The Buddha was a human being. And some of the things I was reading out on the previous couple of days, the point I was trying to make was precisely that. You read some of those suttas and you get a feeling for the humanity of the Buddha as you do that. And that is very powerful. You can meet the Buddha. You can talk to him. You can have conversations. When you talk about your heartache, when you talk about the difficulty of renouncing the world, when you talk about the arguments you have with your parents or your spouse, the Buddha understands exactly what you're talking about because he is also a human being. So the Buddha is human. This is the first point. The second point is that even though it was 2,500 years ago, it doesn't make people any different. People are basically the same across time and across societies. There is an interesting bias in human beings. It actually is one of those human beings, we are full of biases of all kinds. And one of these biases is called the present bias, whereby we always prefer the present time. We think the present time is more real, the present time is more advanced, the present time is better than it was in the past. It's called present bias. And one of the biases is called the present bias, whereby we always prefer the present time. We think the present time is more real, the present time is more advanced, the present time is better than it was in the past. It's called present bias. Yeah, it's called present bias. And if you think about the world, what it was 100 years ago, yeah, I know sometimes you watch these black and white movies from 100 years ago and people talk in a funny way. Have you seen that? Or even from not even 100 years ago, like 60, 70 years ago, the 1950s, and the way they talk in the movies or they talk on the film, it's kind of funny. It sounds like a different time, something kind of weird, yeah, out of the ordinary. And so straight away, there's an othering happen, a distancing from that time. But actually, these people are just like us. There was no difference. Even 70, 80 years ago, we can't connect. But of course they are the same. My mother, for goodness sake, is 85 years old. She's still alive. She's a completely ordinary person. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with my mum. She doesn't sound like those people in those movies. Yeah, she sounds ordinary. And so we need to take away the sense of separation. People are the same. The present isn't any more advanced than the past. Okay, we have iPhones. Is that advanced or is it going backwards? I'm not sure. Sometimes I think it's going backwards because we are just more distracted and more kind of, it's a bad thing sometimes. And then by understanding that culture and time and these kind of things is just a thin layer on the outside. But the essence of a human being is the same. We all want the same thing. We all want to be happy. We want to overcome the troubles and difficulties in life. We want to have more metta. We want to have more compassion for the world. We want to be more wise. Ordinary people, they want to have a nice, ordinary life. They don't want to have too many problems. We are basically the same. And wherever you go in the world, you see the same human condition. Whenever you go in time, you see the same human condition. You see the people at the time of the Buddha. You read about how they reacted, how they lived their life. Yeah, they formed families. They fell in love. They felt hard when their families died. They felt terrible heartache because of that. They went crazy because of the dying of other people. They were angry. They were shouting at each other. They were just like people today. There is no difference really. When you read between the lines, when you don't just read about the arahantship and the profound samadhis, but you read about the actual character of people, you see it is essentially the same. And so we need to take away the barriers. The Buddha is not a myth. The Buddha is not a legend. He's a real person, very much like us, who existed 2,500 years ago. You could bow down to the Buddha. He was someone really extraordinary who existed at that time. He was much more than anyone you can meet in the present day. And so when you come to the Buddha and start to think about the Buddha in this way, he is the one who gives us access to the profoundest, deepest levels of what it means to be a human being. That is what the Buddha gives you. It becomes very beautiful when you start to think about it like this. And then, when you bow down to the Buddha, you bow down to something that really feels very powerful and very important. So this is the idea of bowing down to the Buddha. Every time you bow down to the Buddha, you're doing Buddhanusati. That is really what I think bowing down to the Buddha is about. The recollection of the Buddha, recollection of this person who gives us access to these things. I have sometimes been very surprised. One of the things that always surprises me, we often have these arguments about whether rebirth is true or not, whether there is any evidence for rebirth. What evidence is there for rebirth? And people will come out with all of these kind of evidences, the children who remember past lives, all these ideas that the mind can exist independent of the body, near-death experiences, terminal lucidity, and all of these kind of things that people come with. And all of those things are very interesting evidences for rebirth. And I think all of those point us in the direction that the normal way we think about the world is lacking. There is more to the world than just the material phenomena of the world. This can be shown by all of these very special cases. And so all of that is very interesting. And still, is it an absolute proof of rebirth? No, probably not. It is just indicating the possibility. So among all the evidence for rebirth, there is one piece of evidence that is far more powerful than any other kind of evidence. And it is not the idea that children remember the past lives. It is not the idea that you can have out-of-body experience or near-death experiences. It is not even the fact that you can remember your past lives. Well, if you can remember your past lives securely, that, of course, is a very, very powerful one. But for people who cannot remember the past lives, there is one piece of evidence that is the most powerful of all pieces of evidence. And that is that the Buddha said that there is rebirth. That is the one that really matters. And it is very interesting when you say that. And people, why is it that people don't think that automatically? Why is it that we always have to go to these children remembering past lives? And the reason is because we don't connect with the Buddha in the right way. We don't connect with the Buddha as a teacher. If you go to school and the teacher tells you that 1 + 1 is 2, what do you say? Do you say, rubbish, it's not 2, yeah, go away, teacher? Is that what you say? Or do you say, yes, ma'am, yes, sir, you probably, I accept that. When the teacher says that whatever they say about volcanoes or geography, there's a land north of Sri Lanka called India. Do you tell the teacher, rubbish, there's no land called India? Or do you say, yes, ma'am, I trust what you're saying? Of course, when we go to school, we trust the teacher. And for good reason. Why would a teacher lie to us, right? People don't normally lie. And if people are good teachers, we can assume that they're telling us the truth. And so when we go to school, we accept the things that we learn in school. The history, the geography, the maths, the sciences, and all of these kind of things. And of course, we should do that. Still, some of the things you learn in school may be wrong. Yeah, not everything in our history books may be right. History books are never complete. There's always things missing. As the old saying goes, history is always written by the victors. What about the losers? Did they get the history heard? Probably not. And so history is always going to have some degree of bias. That some of the things you learn in school are going to be maybe a little bit dodgy. And that is because of the limits of the understanding, the limits of what actually can be taught to people. But when the Buddha says there is rebirth, the Buddha is also a teacher, just like the teacher in school, except that he is a far more powerful teacher. He's a teacher who doesn't have any vested interest. He's a teacher who doesn't get any salary. Yeah, he doesn't care whether you believe him or not. There's no vested interest for the Buddha. When the Buddha says there is rebirth, it is a far more powerful and believable statement than when an ordinary teacher tells you something at school. Remember, the Buddha is a teacher like a school teacher, except a far more important teacher. And when you think about it like that, the Buddha is just like this. And why don't we just accept that there is rebirth if the Buddha says so? That is what we should do. The Buddha of the suttas is someone with endless patience, someone with incredible integrity. You look at the suttas, how cohesive they are, how coherent they are, how they hold together. These are the only religious scriptures in the world where there is no scope for violence or anger or anything like that. These are extremely wholesome scriptures with great integrity, and the mind behind this would have been an extraordinary mind. This is the greatest teacher ever. If anyone is going to tell you the truth, it is the Buddha. And he says, this is the reality of the world. There is rebirth. That should be the primary evidence for every one of us that there is rebirth. The reason we reject it is because we are not able to relate to the Buddha in the right way. So this is, to me, becomes very powerful. Sometimes you will hear in the, people, maybe especially in the West, but I think actually everywhere these days, whether in the Western world or in Asia or wherever you are, people will say that a belief in rebirth is like a cultural belief. Yeah, it is a belief that belongs to a certain culture, and that's why you believe it. Yeah, while the modern view that there is no rebirth, that is like the scientific belief. Yeah, it is outside of culture. It has to do with investigating reality. But actually, that's completely wrong. That is actually the other way around. It is the idea that there is no rebirth. That is the cultural belief that we have now. That is cultural because it is conditioned by certain views that are prominent right now. Science has never shown anything about rebirth anyway. Science shows all kinds of things, but doesn't really have anything to say about rebirth. If you look at the history of Western philosophy, sometimes they believe the mind is kind of primary, sometimes they believe the material phenomena are primary. It's always kind of seesawing back and forth. There is no stability in the views. So it is the modern view that there is no rebirth. That is the cultural view, if you understand these things in the right way. And the view of the Buddha that there is rebirth is definitely not a cultural view, because it is a view coming from inside, coming from understanding and appreciation of reality. That is the real view. That is the correct understanding. And so once you start to see things in this way, it turns things really upside down. We kind of often get these things completely wrong. And then we are really starting to appreciate what the Buddha is, who he is, and what he is giving us access to. Just the idea of rebirth is so important. If you understand that, so many other things fall into place in terms of the jigsaw of the Dhamma. Everything starts to gel, everything comes together. Rebirth is absolutely fundamental for understanding what the Dhamma is about. So much comes out of that. And it is all about understanding, in many ways, understanding the Buddha in the right way. So try to make the Buddha real. Imagine that you meet the Buddha, understand him as a real person, someone who has access to these extraordinary teachings, the greater meaning of life. And when you know that you are in the presence of that, how can you not feel joy? How can you not feel happy that you have access to these extraordinary things? This is really what this is about. So let us just have a very brief look at some of these ideas in this Itipiso formula. So the Blessed One is perfected. Perfected here is the idea of the Arahant, the worthy one, perfected in the sense of having given up all defilements. It's a particular kind of perfection. It's not kind of perfection in the modern sense, but a particular kind of perfection as defined by the suttas. You have given up your defilements, etc., and you have developed the mental qualities to the highest level. You are a fully awakened Buddha. You have awakened. I like this word, to be awake. You have come out of the slumber, you have come out of the darkness, and you have seen kind of the light in the world. You understand what is really going on. Awakened from the sleep, awakened from the sleep of delusion, and now finally knowing what is going on. That is really the Buddha. If you accept the idea that you are probably deluded, then of course you have a good reason for being grateful to the Buddha, to giving you access to non-delusion. He is accomplished in knowledge and conduct. This is one of those really important ones. You have knowledge here means really vidya. I think knowledge is not a nice translation, because knowledge implies going to university or whatever and learning something. It is really insight, I think, is a much better translation of the word vidya. The te vidya, rebirth, karma, and becoming an arahant, or the full insight into the three characteristics, these are really the three insights rather than the three knowledges. I think knowledge really underestimates what this is about. So you have accomplished an insight and conduct. You have the full insight into the nature of existence. You understand the full breadth of existence. You understand the deepest possibilities of samadhi. You understand the ability to overcome delusion. The full understanding of the human condition. What is possible as a human being? What is not possible? What is dukkha? What is sukha? All of these kind of things. And coming with that comes the understanding, comes the conduct as well. When you have a profound transformation psychologically, it affects how you are as a human being. It leaves a trace in your conduct. You become a different kind of person. You behave differently in the world. And this is what is so beautiful, because that is how we can recognize the noble people. We can recognize them by their conduct, by how they speak, by all of these kind of things. If there wasn't a transformation in conduct, it would be very hard to recognize the noble people. So the Buddha looks different. The Aryas look different. They have a different interest than ordinary people. And that's how we recognize there's something special in the world, something going on. As I mentioned the other day, just seeing a noble person, seeing an arahant, is an eye-opener, because you see something that is different from what you ordinarily see in society. And it kind of, whoa, what's going on here? It gives you a feeling of a potential for something higher, something more profound. So that is the idea of vijja chadana sampanno, the idea that the Buddha has the full insight into existence. And again, this is kind of really extraordinary when you think about it, if you really believe that. Of course, this relies on a degree of faith. You have to have a degree of confidence in these things. But once that confidence comes, that there is such a person, and you get that by reading the suttas, you get that by seeing people who are living out the suttas, and you get it through your own practice. Gradually it comes about. The Buddha is the knower of the world, the loka vidu, again, the seer of the world. And of course, the idea here is again the idea that you have this broad vision of everything that is possible in the world. All kinds of rebirth are understood. Any kind of attainment that exists in the world in terms of samadhi, in terms of all of these kind of things, all that has been understood by the Buddha. So the Buddha has access to things that for most people is just a dream, is just no idea about. The Buddha has access to that through his meditation. And this is what makes him so special. He understands the limits, the bounds of the world, the heights of happiness, the lows of dukkha, and this is kind of what he has available for us. So this is kind of the beginning of Buddha Nusati, the recollection of the Buddha. There is more to be said about this. I'm going to talk more about the Buddha Nusati tomorrow morning, because I think it is a very interesting topic, and I think it's really important to make it come alive, to get a feeling for the Buddha. One of my really favorite stories of the Buddha, if you want to kind of become an approachable person, and this is a story that is one of the really beautiful ones found in the Vinaya Pitaka, which many of you will have heard before, but nevertheless is maybe worthwhile bringing it up again. And this is a story where the Buddha is walking around among the monks, and he will often do that. He will walk around the kutis, and he will look at the various kutis and see what the monks are up to. And in one of these little situations, he walks around and he sees a monk sewing his robe. He's mending his robe. There's a hole in the robe, and the monk is mending it. Patch of cloth, sewing by needle. Of course, needle is what they had in those days. And the Buddha says, "Well done. Good on you, bhikkhu. For mending your robe." Little things like that. It's kind of really nice. You see the Buddha in an ordinary interaction with the monks around him. And on this other occasion, the Buddha comes to a monk, and this monk is really sick. He has dysentery, and dysentery is very filthy sickness where everything just comes out of you. You're really kind of filthy. And then the Buddha goes up to this monk and says, "Well, how come you are lying in all this filth? Where are your companions in the holy life to look after you?" And the monk says, "Well, I don't do anything for my companions. And so because I don't do anything for my companions, they don't do anything for me. So they're just kind of, here I am, completely sick. No one looks after me." And then the Buddha says to Venerable Ananda, he says, "Well, if no one else is going to look after this monk, we will look after him." And then the Buddha, together with Venerable Ananda, they get water, they clean him up. This is the kind of the filthiest possible situation. Clean him up, wash his robe, get some fresh robes, put some fresh robes on him, lift him up. The Buddha takes him by the head, Venerable Ananda by the feet, lift him up and put him on the bed so he can recover from his illness. It's beautiful, This is the Buddha doing kind of the most dirty work imaginable. It's almost difficult to think, yeah? But this shows you the humanity of the Buddha. It shows you how he lives with compassion, with care among his fellow monastics. It's really a beautiful example for everyone. And then the Buddha, of course, goes out and he talks to the other monks and he asks them, why are you not look after this monk? And they say, well, he doesn't do anything for us, so we don't do anything for him. It's pretty bad, right? How can you think like that? This is not how you should think as a monastic. And then the Buddha says, well, don't think like this, monks. You have no mother and father. If you don't look after each other, who is going to look after you? And then he has this beautiful saying. He says that whoever would look after me, whoever would look after the Buddha, that person should also look after any fellow monastic in the community. Yeah, if you are the person who would look after the Buddha, and who wouldn't look after the Buddha? Yeah, if you saw the Buddha was sick, would you help the Buddha? Of course you would. It means you should help any monastic in a community. That is what the Buddha is saying. Anyway, these are some of the little stories, some of the little things. So when you read the suttas, notice the Buddha, notice how he interacts, get a feeling for who the Buddha is, and then the idea of Buddhanussati gradually comes alive because of this. And I will continue with Buddhanussati tomorrow morning. So that is all for now, so please carry on enjoying yourself. It is not an order, but I recommend it, and then we'll come back at 6 o'clock for the Q&A session.